Psalm 136, I welcome everybody for a psalm known as Hallel Hagadol, the Great Hallel. This psalm gets that title in the Talmud, in Brachot, the tractate that deals with prayers, 4b, and then Psachim, the tractate that deals with Passover, 118a. And in that regard, regarding Passover, the psalm that we're going to share is included in our Haggadah. There are two Hallels. Hallel meaning praise. There is what is called Hallel Mitzrayim, the Hallel of Egypt, 113 to 118, 115 to 118, and that is also divided as part of our Seder. And then at the end, there's also this psalm, Psalm 136, which is distinctly called Hallel Hagadol, the Great Hallel. But these words have other places in our Jewish rhythm. In the grace after meals, after every meal that began with bread, in the opening paragraph is verse 25, and in the closing paragraph is verse 1. And so 136 resonates on a regular basis. It's also chanted in full as part of our Pesukei de Zimra, the introductory prayers on Shabbat morning, on holidays, and Hoshana Rabbah. You'll see that there is a call and response throughout the 26 verses of Psalm 136. The number 26 for the rabbis is immediately identified with God's name, Yud He Vav He, which equals numerically 26. And I note that there's a call and a refrain, and the refrain is 3 words: ki, for or because, le'olam, forever, hasdo, is God's kindness, is God's love. And that refrain, ki le'olam hasdo, chanted by the entire people, has a place in the dedication of both Solomon's temple and in the book of Ezra in the dedication of the second temple. Here's a little bit of a description from the dedication of the first temple built by Solomon. When Solomon finished praying, fire descended from heaven, chapter 7, and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. The priests could not enter the house of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. All the Israelites witnessed the descent of the fire and the glory of the Lord on the house. They knelt with their faces to the ground and prostrated themselves, praising the Lord and saying, Ki tov, for God is good, ki le'olam hasdo, for eternally is God's hesed, God's kindness. And likewise, that event of the dedication of the first temple is roughly the year 960 before the Common Era. And now it's about over 400 years later when the second temple is built, and that is described in the book of Ezra in chapter 3, verse 11. they sang songs extolling and praising the Lord, saying, Ki tov, ki leolam hasdo, for God is good, God's hesed is eternal. All the people raised a great shout, extolling the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord had been laid. And so, in a moment, to hear the psalm, there are echoes of choirs of the past in this context of the dedication of the temple, first and second. It's as if the people have witnessed a great miracle, whether it's the fire coming down from heaven in the first temple or the rebuilding of the second. And that's where we get this refrain, Ki leolam hasdo, for forever is God's kindness. With that, let's look at Psalm 136. For forever is God's kindness. Give thanks to Adonai, for God is good. For forever is God's kindness. Give thanks to the God of gods, for forever is God's kindness. Give thanks to the Supreme of Supremes, for forever is God's kindness. To the Maker of great wonders all alone, for forever is God's kindness. To the Maker of the heavens with understanding, for forever is God's kindness. To the spreader of the earth over the waters, for forever is God's kindness. To the maker of great lights, for forever is God's kindness. The sun to rule by day, for forever is God's kindness. The moon and stars to rule by night, for forever is God's kindness. To the Smiter of Egypt through their firstborn, for forever is God's kindness. And brought out Israel from their midst, for forever is God's kindness. With a strong hand and with an outstretched arm, beyad chazaka uvizroa netuyah, for forever is God's kindness. To the parter of the sea of reeds into parts, for forever is God's kindness. And caused Israel to pass through its midst, for forever is God's kindness. And shook Pharaoh and his army into the sea of reeds, for forever is God's kindness. To the guider of God's people through the wilderness, for forever is God's kindness. To the smiter of great kings, for forever is God's kindness. And slew mighty kings, for forever is God's kindness. Sichon, king of the Amorites, for forever is God's kindness. And Og, king of Bashan, for forever is God's kindness. And gave their land for a heritage, for forever is God's kindness. A heritage to Israel, God's servant, for forever is God's kindness. Who in our lowliness remembered us, for forever is God's kindness, and tore us away from our tormentors, for forever is God's kindness. Giver of bread to all flesh, for forever is God's kindness. Give thanks to the El of the heaven, Hodu le'el hashamayim, Ki leolam hasdo, for forever is God's kindness. I was once in an Orthodox synagogue in New York, and somebody, before the service began, struck up a conversation, and he asked me what I did. I told him I was a conservative rabbi in California, and he said to me, I once went to a conservative synagogue. I was so upset. In their Shabbat morning prayers, they skipped over Psalm 136. Can you imagine? And I frankly didn't know Psalm 136 that closely. I did know you had a choice of Pesukei to Zimra and the introductory prayers, what gets chanted and not. But I as I prepared this psalm and as I've learned it more deeply, I smile to know how important this psalm was to that individual. Again, this psalm called Hallel Hagadol, the Great Hallel. A Hallel that, as we see, describes the power of God in a variety of ways. God as creator of the world, God who redeemed Israel and guided Israel in the journey through the desert and aided the victory over the kings who opposed Israel in their approach to the land. And it culminates remarkably in a universal dimension. In fact, the closing line, give thanks to the Le'el Hashamayim, to the God, to the divine of the heaven, is a unique phrase, a universal phrase. The closest to it, which is pretty close, is in Ezra chapter 1, verse 2, we have the expression Elohei Hashamayim, the God of heaven. And here it's to the El of the heaven. And verse 25. Verse 25, the trajectory builds to describing God and a shift of the God active in the life as creator of redemption to the giver of bread to all flesh, for forever is God's kindness. And there's a discussion on this psalm in the tractate Psachim, the Talmudic tract that deals with Passover 118a. And there's the following quote. Rab Shizvi says, citing Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the task of providing a person's food is as difficult as the splitting of the Red Sea, as it is written, quoting verse 25, and juxtaposed to it is the verse, quoting verse 13, to God who divided the Red Sea asunder. The reiteration of the last part of the verse indicates that the two praises are to a certain extent equivalent, which is to say that in providing food each day, we are experiencing a miracle. Because this is, and I always delight in how almost every psalm, there is some word or phrase that is unique. And here the unique phrase is Le'el Hashamayim, to the God of the heavens. That's understood in two different ways, precisely because it's so unusual. Rashi, the great French Jewish commentator of the 11th century, will say it's to highlight that even though God dwells b'shamayim, in the heavens, who dwells above, nonetheless, God is concerned with those below, verses 25 and 26. Ibn Ezra and Radak, generation after Rashi in Spain, will say, why is he the God of the heavens? Because God provides rain. That's the reference to Shemayim, which allows the crops to grow. In either case, the trajectory of this psalm is a psalm of God being praised for God's hesed, God's kindness, for Israel and then for the world. A word about the word hesed. Chesed literally means kindness or loving kindness. It's also translated by some as faithfulness, because when used to describe God, chesed is identified with fulfilling the promises of the covenant. In terms of the word le'olam, forever, there is a nice comment by the Sfat Hemet, Hasidic master, the master of the Hasidei Gur, who lived in Ukraine in the 18th century. And he said, although the psalm describes events, like the 10th plague, the cumulative effect of hesed, of God's kindness, is not event-bound. It's not momentary. Rather, cumulatively, it's enduring. Le'olam, it's forever. And that's the message of the psalm. We're going to start from the beginning of the psalm to say that we can find ourselves in the temple, where the Levites on their elevated platforms are chanting. In our synagogues, it's the cantor. I'm looking at my dear friend Cantor Shula, who would chant the first half of each verse. And because it's only 3 words, congregation can quickly learn the refrain. Ki leolam hasdo. For forever is God's goodness, God's hesed, God's love. And the repetition, this call and refrain, this antiphonal singing, created the sense of community. It bound people together in relationship with God, and not unlike a mantra, a phrase that gets repeated, chanted over and over, it can lead to this quality of altered state of joy. In the opening 3 verses, there are 3 different names for God. Ki tov ki leolam hasdo. The first name of God here is Hodu Ladonai, give thanks, which can also be translated as give praise or acclaim, to Yud He Vav He, the name of God identified with covenant, with relationship, with redemption. And then Ki Tov Ki Leolam Hasdo, that's the full phrase echoed at the dedication of the temple. And now the second name of God in verse 2, Elohei HaElohim, the God of gods. Now, much commentary, who are the other gods? Some would say that the other gods are the gods, it's like Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. It's to say God is the superlative of all gods, not like all those other gods people worship. This is the real God, Ha-Elohei Ha-Elohim, God of the gods, the only true God, which has echoes perhaps to an earlier time of belief in multiple gods. Adonai Ha-Adonim, an unusual description of God in verse 3, I translate it as the supreme of supremes. I always think of the Motown group, the Supremes, when I say it. But I like the word supreme in terms of it could be the master of masters, the Lord of lords. And here, the rabbis will have different understandings of who is referred to. So Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, will see supremes as the visible stars in the sky, the heavenly bodies, that God is the supreme over the heavenly bodies. Ibn Ezra will identify this with the angels. And that's also the way Elohim in verse 2 is understood. And so you get here in verses 1 to 3, 3 different ways of identifying God and thereby praising God, which leads to the final verse, where here again God is given not only a name but a uniquely used name as El Hashamayim, the divine of the heavens. Some would point out that if you take out these 4 verses that are, the proclamation of God's respective identities, you get 22 verses, which is the number of letters in the alphabet, which is to say this psalm is all-inclusive, whether being 26 equaling God's name or 22 plus 4 as all letters of the alphabet. And now, with one eye on the clock, I just want to point out some unusual phrases. Verse 4 culminates the first section, which is the introduction. Then what we'll have is verses 5 to 9, a description of God as creator of the celestial bodies. Then verses 10 to 15, and that's God's liberation of the Israelites from Egypt. Verses 16 to 20 is God's guidance in the wilderness. And 21 through 26, kind of a culmination, summation, leading to those last 2 verses, 25 and 26, which are the universal giver of bread. And so just some individual unusual words. Verse 4, to the maker of great wonders, la'oseh niflaot gedolot, and now this word, livado, alone. What does it mean, alone? The classic commentators, Rashi and Radak, will say God didn't need any help. That's what is getting emphasized. Interestingly, the Zohar will do a little bit of a commentary riff on this word as well. Zohar Volume 3, 200b, and it will say that only God knows the good acts that God does. So when you are walking along, you may not know that God turned a serpent away that you might have stepped on and thereby been bitten by. That's also the undisclosed miracle. Or when robbers wanted to rob you and something happened and it was thwarted. And so livado in the Zohar is not only the doing is God alone, but the knowing is God alone. Here's another riff opportunity for a strange grammatical use. Verse 10. To the Smiter of Egypt, and now bichorehem. Here I translated as through their firstborn or with their firstborn. And here there's an anomaly. What does it mean through their firstborn? It can, of course, mean that, and this is how it opens, and we saw this in Psalm 135:8, the psalm right before this that emphasizes the 10th plague as the plague, both the plague that enabled the final redemption, but the plague par excellence. But here, this grammatical piece, through their firstborn, there's a midrash that is remarkable, which is that, and Rashi picks it up, although it also appeared before Rashi in Midrash Tehillim, which says that there was a civil war on the eve of redemption. Namely, the firstborns said in the original Midrash to their fathers, tell Pharaoh to take Moses seriously and not allow the 10th plague, because it's our lives on the line. And when they, the fathers, failed to act, the sons rebelled. That'll be taken out in the use in Rashi, where it'll be kind of more of a civil war, where it's more than just where it's the firstborns rebelling, but against more than just their fathers, on the eve of the 10th plague, which is an added dimension of how it was that this 10th plague proved so decisive. I delighted in this midrash because I hadn't seen this midrash before, namely of the civil war by the firstborns on the eve of redemption, and how it all comes down to this one letter, this bet here, which would be translated as through their firstborn. Here's another anomaly that allows for rabbinic play, and that is verse 13. To the parter of the sea of reeds, ligzarim, into parts, and it's in the plural. And that leads an earlier speculation that, in a midrash, that rather than just being split into two and people walking through the middle, it was split into multiple paths. And you get that kind of imagery can also in Isaiah chapter 11:15, in his description of the wadis of Egypt in the future being split into 7. Here and based on this plural, ligzarim, there would later be the midrash that each tribe had its own path. A later commentator who I mentioned, the Sfat Emet, that founder of the Gur Hasidim, would say that their 12 paths would reflect an individual role for each of the tribes. And now just some closing thoughts. Only does it shift in verses 23 and 24 to the use of the first person plural, who in our lowliness remembered us and tore us away from our tormentors. Those are the 2 times in this psalm when it's not describing God and God's wonders, but it is personalized in the communal. And in that regard, Zohar Lanu, who remembered us, that's the trajectory of the Seder. Namely, the trajectory of the Seder is when we remember what God did for us, that gives us hope for the future. That gives us the confidence that God will redeem us from our exile, will redeem us from our broken world. And in fact, in verse 24, tore us away from our tormentors, mitzarenu. Rashi will understand this as our Egyptian taskmasters. But Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi in Spain, 12th century, will say the one who tore us away from our tormentors is from our exile, whether the Babylonian exile or that longer exile in which he lived. And so at our Seder, we opened the door for Elijah to enter because, and that's after the telling of the story at the end of the meal, because if God has taken us in the past out of Egypt, we can now look forward to the final redemption. And that's how this psalm was also understood. A chanting of Ki leolam hasdo, for God's kindness, God's love is eternal. It is eternal both because hu mechadesh et kol yom tamid, God renews God's creation perpetually. And hence verses 24 and 25, we are reminded that the events of the past, those miracles that enabled redemption, are no different than everyday occurrences of the bread that we eat, and that as God remembered us, and we recount all these events, so therefore we live with hope. One closing image to pull this together, and that is I was watching the news last night and seeing the children in impoverished lands to our American South, who, although 12 years old, look 6 years old due to famine. Mothers sending their children north because their next door neighbor's child has died of starvation. There's a story of the news last night in terms of what would it take to seal the border, and they said, as long as there's starvation, people will keep coming. And with that image of children without food and the desperation that it leads to, of a mother letting go of a child to the unknown. So we are reminded in this psalm that as great as any redemption of the past is the miracle and the opportunity of daily bread. I also, whenever I use the word miracle, I hear the words of the Talmud, al tismoch benes, do not rely on a miracle, which is to say, we must do all that we can to be the enabler of what we seek. And if this psalm culminates in the praise of God as giver of bread to all flesh, l'chol basar, that's the shift from the particular, from us and our, to all flesh, to all peoples, to all living creatures. So that trajectory of this psalm is the trajectory toward both hope, but also our responsibility. A trajectory that gains momentum precisely because this is the Great Hallel of call and refrain, in which the voice of community in repetition of faith enables the promise that the psalm relates. With that, as a look at Hallel Hagadol, the Great Hallel, I welcome some thoughts that might have been evoked in our study of Psalm 136, and then an opportunity to say a word about our honoree. Any questions or thoughts about Psalm 136? Cantor Shula and then Richard.
There. I see the word shamayim in verses 5 and then 26 as actually a beautiful poetic choice in general, because I think that the poet in the very beginning explains why God is master of masters, God of gods, and all that, by saying that he is the creator of heaven and earth. As we know, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim. And then as a bookend, he closes again as a reminder, all of that and all those thanks that you must give and all these reasons that God is great is because God is El Hashamayim, namely the creator of everything. So I see it not only as an important concept, but I think as a poetic choice by the poet of this particular psalm.
Thank you. That's an astute observation. So I just pull it up so everyone can see Shula's sensitivity of reading. You know, there are words that are called the inclusio, the envelope, the frame. And in this case, verses 1 to 4 are introductory. And then the body of the text is 5 to 26. And Shula points out that there is a word that appears in both and that gives context and content. And that is the word heavens. La'oseh hashamayim bitvuna, to the maker of the heavens with understanding. And then the concluding line is the other time this word is mentioned. Hodu le'el hashamayim, give thanks to the El of the, and I'm going to change this to the El of the heavens for symmetry. And because it's also in the plural in Hebrew. And that's to say, we're returning to God, who is the creator God. And that is God's awesomeness, that all that we have is due to the God who is the creator. And you can't help but, again, back up to the verse right before, which is the trajectory from creation in verse 5 to the giving of bread to all in verse 25, both a product of a creator God. Thank you, Shula, for pointing out that inclusio, that envelope of the word Hashemayim. And Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I was interested in your find of the rebellion by Egypt's firstborn. I missed the reference, and I was wondering if you just happen to have that reference. That would and we would be willing to pass it on.
So in verse 10, I mentioned that the line in Hebrew has an anomaly of grammar and a choice of words. It could be Lamakeh Mitzrayim, and then the word is Biv Chorehem, and it doesn't have to be. It could be into the Smiter of Egypt through their firstborn, meaning through the plague of the firstborn. But the rabbis, starting with a midrash, and it's called Midrash Tehillim, and that collection of rabbinic homilies is collected before Rashi. It's not clear exactly when and where it was written, but the nature of midrash is you look for an anomaly and you build on it. An anomaly in the Hebrew, in grammar, in an extraneous word, and here it's in this extraneous preposition, the through, the biv, and then they tell this story. And Rashi, interestingly, I often quote Rashi because he's the most influential of the medieval commentators, France 1040 to 1105. And he largely, not only, but largely harvests commentaries before him, and with an extraordinary gift, cites those commentaries in a very concise way, but often with a little editing. And what Rashi will do in his commentary on the Psalm here is he will recount this rabbinic imagining of the firstborns on the eve, having heard Moses' threat, that next up is the plague of the death of the firstborn, who will engage in a civil war in response to Pharaoh's failure to free the Israelites. So that's the nature of the Midrash, and I haven't seen that in the Haggadah, but all it takes is a preposition to allow the mind's creativity.
It's wonderful. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So any one last comment? And I don't see any hands. So a word about our honoree. I am delighted, Batya, that Hal, you had something to say? No? Okay. So Batya, I'm delighted to have you as the honoree. One, because, this is called the Great Psalm, Hallel Hagadol, which actually the rabbis debate in the Talmud of Pesachim 118a. Some say it should start at 134, 135, and 136. Some say just 135 and 136, but the majority and how it gets recorded in the Code of Jewish Law and the Shulchan Aruch is only this psalm, distinctly Psalm 136, will retain the title as the Great Psalm in that it provides the sweep of history. Though I will add that what is not in this psalm is the Ten Commandments, the giving at Mount Sinai. And you would think if you're going to do the history of liberation and redemption to the entry into the promised land, you don't want to overlook that event. So the rabbis will, again, need to explain the absence and will say, this is simply God's beneficence. Ten Commandments is about responsibilities. This is simply hesed. This is simply love and the giving what is not even deserved. And in that regard, Batya is a caregiver. Her career, particularly at the end of her career, was as a guidance counselor in high schools, as somebody who brought a lifetime of life experience to directing young people with hope as to their future, to being a therapist, a counselor, and dealing and untying of knots in their own life. And as this is a psalm of kindness, chesed, and of celebration, of engagement, it feels particularly lovely to have it in your honor, Batya. Batya, as some of you may know, was also my partner in launching small groups this year. In fact, I had with Mimi, who's on, and others, a little gathering with a small group last night. And it's a continuation of the study that we had earlier in the year. So that is an example of Batya as my partner. Batya, a closing word on Psalm 136 or about community study?
One of the things that was going through my mind, it was very personalized for me in a way. And my father's name was Solomon, and my father was a very wise and kind man. And I was thinking, about the temple and not relying on miracles, and that you've got to help things and enable. And we have to be grateful for so many things. And I'm just very, very honored that you honored me for this. And thank you.
Oh, I'm delighted to know of that personal connection, Batya, is Solomon the Wise, Shlomo HaMelech, and your dad, and how this refrain, Ki Tov Ki Leolam Hasdo, is the refrain that was evoked in Solomon's key achievement of building a place of both gathering and communion. Well, I'm delighted. So we're going to say Kaddish in a moment. And again, I thank you, Batya, for allowing us to dedicate our learning to your gifts, your many gifts on this day. I will add, so we're skipping over 137, which is by the rivers, by the rivers of Babylon. So that important psalm until next week, because my friend and teacher, Rabbi Eddie Feinstein, will be our honoree, and he could only make it next week. And I'll tell you more why I asked him to be the honoree for Psalm 137, which will be a week from Thursday. But we're going to skip over. So tomorrow we'll do Psalm 138 and then Thursday 139.